And then from there, we just started to become aware of the limitations of the university to properly educate us. And we also saw the racism of the institution and the way that it supported the fraternities. I mean, back then, it was not unusual to be walking through what's called Bruin Walk, which is the main it's kind of like that center point where if you want to get from one side to the campus to another, you kind of go through there. And if you're going to go through the dorms, you're eventually going to pass through there. And that's also where the students line up, their banners or signs. And it's still that way. It's very interesting, even though we're in a different time where they'll kind of recruit you. And I just remember the way in which we'd get harassed. I mean, you're walking and they can just tell you spick, they can tell you beaner, and you could complain, and it was, it shouldn't happen, and that's about it. Yeah. And the fraternities would actually have parties where they would have bob wire, and the way to get in is you had to actually get wet. They'd wet you, and you had to come in as a, quote, wetback into their party. That was the norm.
Hello, I'm Nicholas Seguiri. I'm the host of Trailblazing Latinos. I'm here today with Minnie Ferguson. She's the Director of Education of Semillas Community Schools. She's also the head of school at Anahuacameca International University Preparatory High School of North America. She's also a faculty member at UCLA. She's an educator, and she's a community organizer. Minnie, thank you for coming onto the show today.
Thank you for inviting me.
When I first thought about doing the show, it was automatic. I already knew who I wanted, and you were the first person that I wanted because I think you're a person who's successful and inspiring, and I really think you could help people who identify as Mexican or Latinos in a cultural way as well. You've done a lot in your career, and I invited you on today because I know you'll help inspire people, and you'll help people learn from your story and from your success.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. The first thing I want to start with you kind of helped me starting that already. You said that you want to talk about, I guess, your experience as a little girl coming to America and your first experience in education, and I guess having the struggle between English and Spanish. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, of course. When I was 4 years old, we started to think of the process of how to migrate. And my mother in particular worked on her coming to the United States first, and then brought my sister and I over to the United States with the help of some friends. At that point, we were undocumented, and we did not have legal status to be in the United States. It was a difficult transition for me in particular. I can still recall really missing my mother and just being overjoyed to live with her again and to be a part of her life again. But I also had a lot of difficulty starting school. I remember that my mom tried enrolling me, but because I was a December child, they held me back. And that was a little bit different for us in that that I really didn't understand why I couldn't go to school in Mexico. When I was younger, the school was across the street, and I loved going to school. Mm-hmm. And I actually took my dog, and I was welcome to take my dog. But the atmosphere in the United States was so different, and it had a lot of barriers, one of them being language. So when I had to wait a few months to enroll. I remember that I was put into a regular class, and then I was taken out every day to work with someone that would instruct me specifically in English. And it was a small group of us, sometimes 3-4 of us, and we would work with this individual who's an older white woman trying her best, but using strategies that were very harmful. And for example, I remember how much I wanted to just be able to learn English, just to not be subjected to the way that she taught. So she would actually maybe throw, let's say, a ball at you. I remember this in particular, and toss it back and forth. But as she tossed it, she would raise her voice to almost yell at us, as if the problem was that we were ignorant and deaf, which shouldn't have been a problem if we did have a disability. But it was a way of kind of communicating that we were dumb. And then we were to toss the ball back and pronounce the word the best we could. And I remember working really hard to get out of that special class, because the only way that you could demonstrate that you didn't need that class was to be able to read words, not just repeat words. And I remember that I was so desperate that I not only learned to read the words, I learned to spell them. So there would be no doubt in their minds that they were to transition me out of that program. Right around that time, I remember, and really understanding the history much better, that bilingual education started around that time, that there was an opportunity to also be able to have that type of education. I believe that it wasn't available when I first started school, but it would have been such a different process for me if I had been allowed to speak my name. So one of the instances that I remember, and it's very interesting when I think back, because this person was of Mexican descent, and I would pronounce my name Mene, because my mom had difficulty pronouncing my name, which is Minnie. And she made it a point to tell me how wrong I was to pronounce my name the way I was pronouncing it. And my mom would also spell my name with M-E-N-N-I-E as opposed to M-I-N-N-N-I-E, which is the legal spelling.
Yes.
But she did it in a way that was so disrespectful. You know, she didn't ask me, well, why do you spell your name that way? And when I explained to her, she says, it's all wrong. And, you know, these are moments in a person's life that really can either almost break you, make you feel worthless, or where you really reach within you and say, I'm not going to be subjected to something like this in my life again, where I get treated like I'm a dumb person, where I get to, where I get to decide how I define myself. I didn't want someone to also define my identity for me, or judge my family for their ability to speak English. So it was a really difficult process for me. I remember also at one point, I really was good at math, but there was a point at which I wasn't able to memorize the timetables in the way that the teacher wanted us to memorize them. And she, by then I had transitioned. I spoke English. This was around perhaps 3rd grade, 4th grade. And I remember that the teacher would call out, for example, 4 times 3, 4 times 4, 4 times, and my hand could barely write that fast. Yeah. And if you made a mistake and had to erase it, you pretty much couldn't progress. You were going to fail. I remember this one instance where my hand could not keep up. And then on top of that, I made a mistake. So being that individual that had already been made to feel dumb and had been made to feel that I didn't even know who I was, that I pretty much was a worthless person, I had low self-esteem. So when that happened, instead of speaking up for myself, I cried and I left the room, the classroom, and I went and looked for my sister because she attended the same school. And her teacher was very nice and allowed her to comfort me. And basically, I had mostly very good teachers. I remember my first grade teacher was Japanese American, beautiful person, had other amazing teachers. But in between that were these people that were supposed to support me in my language development, that were either a specialist or were an aide, that really hurt me and hurt my development. And it really took a lot of will from my part to be able to feel that I could compete, with others, that I could actually make something of myself. So it was like pulling yourself up as hard as you could and sit straight in your chair and really be able to defend yourself at times. So for me, it was a difficult transition. I don't think I'm unique in that way. I think everyone almost has a story during the time that I grew up in the 70s where, if you didn't speak English, you really went through a very difficult process of being able to demonstrate that you could be in the regular classes and that you could actually take a math test, and be at the same level as other students who did speak English.
Well, that's an incredible story. I didn't realize how traumatizing some teachers could be to students who are having difficulty learning a second language, and how traumatic and how life-changing that can be. You mentioned, though, that those are moments where you kind of just have to pull yourself up, or you kind of get this strength saying, I'm not going to take this anymore, or I don't want to be in this position anymore. Do you remember that moment where you're like, you know what? I'm going to dominate this language. I do not want to be in this position anymore. I don't want to be felt like a second-class person in this school anymore.
I think that incident with the ball was really that turning point for me, where I didn't want to go to a small class that had no windows, that isolated us, that took me away from my friends, from the learning environment that was nurturing, because most of my teachers were really good teachers. And I said to myself, I have to work twice as hard. I have to just really demonstrate even to myself that there's nothing I can't do, that I can make my mom proud and myself proud. And I just remember working so hard from that point that I really always just worked twice as much. But I remember that because I still felt unsure at times, that when I was in 5th grade, I remember that we were, back then you were always given a test every year to demonstrate your grade level performance. And I remember by then doing really well in math and scoring above grade level. And it was very interesting because at that point, and I think it still happens now, my mom was told in a conference that even though I was above grade level in math, that they didn't have a book to give me, a 6th grade book. So that therefore they were going to keep me in 5th grade. That also was a very important turning point for me, because I knew that in the subject that was still difficult for me, they sure had a strategy for how they were going to still work with me. In other words, when I was in 5th grade, I still had a workbook, and they had these materials called basals that were leveled, and I remember always a year to 2 years behind in English. So I was no longer in those special classes where they pulled you out, but in class, I was always put into the group of low readers. And I remember feeling awful, because here I could show that I was really good, that I was really smart, that I was capable, that I could really be at that other level that perhaps they weren't able to see that the way that I was compensating for language being so difficult for me, that I really went out of my way to then master something that wasn't necessarily based just on language development. So that day I felt so humiliated, because here I was outperforming every student in my class, and yet they couldn't provide an education for me that would help develop that skill and that talent that I had. So I really just kept working hard, and throughout middle school and high school, till I was eventually identified even gifted in high school. And I remember it was a teacher that took the time, because when you're in high school, they no longer really seek to identify you. It's kind of over with.
Yeah.
And I remember that the ball incident, along with knowing that if I did not prove myself to be very capable in every subject, the system would keep me behind. So I just worked hard, and language eventually became an enjoyable thing, and something that I could really demonstrate was not difficult for me. But it wasn't until high school, and even in high school, I remember that I had a teacher, and I was in about 10th grade, who would not give me higher than a B, because she always said that my vocabulary wasn't at the level that it should be, and that even though I wrote well, I didn't demonstrate the capacity that she was looking for. And it was very hurtful, because I asked for help. I drafted several or edited my work several times. I went to her for extra help. I worked hard after school, and it just didn't seem to matter to the teacher in terms of the grade. And I wasn't looking for her to give me a grade. I thought I was earning it, but she had a standard that was almost impossible to meet unless I probably wrote like a middle class white student.
Yeah.
So that, I think, was another turning point for me. So when I then got accepted to UCLA and chose to enroll myself, I actually purposely enrolled in a special program that took you from, you could say, more remedial reading and writing. And it was a special program where you dedicated to a writing and a reading course, that actually the reading course went along with the writing. So it was an intense writing experience of 8 units, along with one other class. And I was able to, for almost a year, be able to concentrate on myself as a student and really see myself develop. And it was really because of this professor that really turned things around for me and told me how talented I was. But she was such a gifted teacher, and she's still a professor at UCLA, by the way. And she really gave us that opportunity to edit our work and to understand how we could really transform our writing into a piece that would communicate exactly what we wanted to any audience. And I think that that was another turning point where I really felt that by my second year, there was nothing that could really stand in my way, that it didn't matter what class I was in at UCLA. I felt equal to everyone. And I have to thank that professor for that as well.
I want to rewind it back a little bit. Like I said, I asked you, you had that moment where you had to realize, I'm not going to be inferior anymore. My self-esteem isn't going to be low anymore. How old were you when you had that realization, or you had that thought that I'm going to dominate this language and I don't want to be in this classroom anymore?
I was about between 5.5 and 6.
Wow. I try to study. I read a lot of books. I try to study the best people that I can. And a lot of people usually have that realization, when they're young adults. And people still have that realization when they're 40, 50, 60. But you had that realization at 5.5, 6 years old.
Yes.
I had that realization too, a little bit different. I wasn't the best student in high school. I think I graduated with a 2.4 GPA. And I remember I got lucky. I don't know how it happened. I got accepted to San Jose State University. And I remember that was my turning point too. Or I was given another opportunity. The admissions, whoever was involved in admissions, gave me an opportunity. There's something about this student, even though he has a bad GPA, we want to give him an opportunity to come to San Jose State. And I remember I was getting rejection letter after rejection letter. I got rejected from Cal State LA, from Chico State, from Humboldt State, from a lot of Cal States. And I remember my self-esteem was affected. And I just remember telling myself, I'm smarter than this. At the same time, I do deserve these rejection letters. This is what I get for basically being a clown in high school. And I remember when I got my acceptance letter to San Jose State, I remember I looked in the mirror, and that's when I told myself, this is my turning point. This is my second chance. I don't want to have this many rejections all at once ever again. Those rejection letters hurt me pretty badly, and that was when I told myself, life has given me a second chance, and I'm going to go to San Jose State, and I'm gonna study my ass off. But I had that when I was 18 years old. It's still, it amazes me that someone at 5.5, 6 years old had that realization, and you continue to have that realization. You said, I think through the math incident too, where you couldn't write your timetables as fast. The incident at high school too, when the teacher said, basically she didn't think your work was worthy of getting an A. And you also mentioned UCLA and that professor. Are you comfortable mentioning that professor's name? Maybe some people want to take that professor and prove their skills like you did.
Definitely. Her name is Bonnie Lyle, and I usually credit her and I name her because she deserves to be.
Well, there we go. Anyone at UCLA listening, or any incoming students, Bonnie Lyle is the professor that you want to have as your professor. I want to transition to UCLA because UCLA played a big role in your life. You were involved in creating a department for Chicana and Chicano studies. And just start wherever you want to start. How did this whole incident happen? From what I understand, while you were attending the school, there were Chicano studies. You could take Chicano study classes, correct? How did everything evolve from there?
The actual hunger strike and other events that were monumental that I think you'll find recorded in history happened when I was at UCLA, but as a master's student. So I already was older.
Okay.
But my work actually started when I was an undergrad. And what happened is that you could take a few classes at UCLA, but think about this. How many classes really could there be, and could you really major in Chicana, and back then it was Chicano studies, when the budget was $2,000 and some dollars?
And what year was this too?
We're going back to the 90s, like
early 90s.
I started as a freshman in 86.
Okay.
The fall of 86. So I was an undergrad for 5 years. Mm-hmm. I did the 5-year program. Now,
I did too.
You have to. It's a good one. I mean, I really, like I said, my first year was about investing in me. Mm. And I think that those opportunities, like you said, how did it happen? How did I can't even tell you how I knew about the course, but someone guided me the right way, because I didn't even attend the freshman summer program, which is a bridge program for students of color in particular, that were then guided. They were mentored, given tutoring, etc., because I really didn't know a whole lot about it, and I was hesitant, and I wanted to work to get money because my mother, being the only person that was providing for the family, was not going to be able to provide the things that I needed, even though we were getting financial aid. there are a lot of things that are not covered by financial aid. So I didn't end up actually having that opportunity. So I had to go straight from a high school experience to UCLA. A lot of the students back then actually got, as I guess this generation will say, are you woke? So back then, the program was dedicated to bring consciousness to the students. And it was a program that many had fought for back in the 70s. And that program had existed for some time. So I actually was recruited into UCLA by what was called the Mariposa program at UCLA. So I have to credit all those that came before me that just, some gave up their opportunity to finish at UCLA, to be able to establish retention programs, recruitment programs, and other things like that. Because when I was back, this information's important to how then I became so aware, even though I didn't take that route that most students were invited into, was because I knew that UCLA, and the reason why I chose UCLA was because both I felt my family could afford it, and because I felt I would be close to home. And I was raised to give to the community. My grandmother always gave to the community as a traditional healer, as a traditional midwife, as a traditional, they call it in Spanish, sobadora, someone who, like a chiropractor, but a traditional one. And I had seen all these instances of giving to the community where you did not get payment for helping someone. If they didn't have money, they gave you something. In my grandmother's case, they might have chickens, they might have things are growing, things like that. So my mom had been obviously, raised to some extent, her coming from an experience of having been raised in a boarding school, in particular being raised by nuns. It had been a difficult experience for her, but she still learned from her mother of traditional ways. And she also was a very giving person. She participated in committees in the school, and even though she didn't speak English, I had that role model. So while there were instances in my life that were difficult and made me stronger and made me more resilient, I always had that example, those role models around me of the importance of giving back. So when I was recruited in, I really felt a sense of like obligation and responsibility to give back, because I felt very fortunate that these individuals went to my high school, looked at my records along with the counselor, and chose me as someone that they would recruit in and that they would mentor and help me with my application. And then, the committees at UCLA did their work, and then I was given an offer. UCLA and USC made me offers. And I really thought about the importance of it being an opportunity where I felt I could be close to home, close to what I knew made me strong, and yet a good school. So when I was at UCLA, I naturally kind of sought opportunities to be around people that way. So I was in that program that I mentioned earlier for reading and writing, and to really become proficient at that. And then realized that there were retention programs started to benefit. And then I saw a sign that said that they wanted peer counselors. But I knew I was too young, because usually peer counselors are role models, and you're usually in your third, fourth year. And here I was finishing up my first year, and what could I share? But even then I knew, you know what? If I can go through these courses and now I'm writing well, I can write an application and I can get myself hired. And I got myself hired. And I was the only the youngest one in the group to get hired. And being a part of that program gave me the opportunity to participate in forums and to put together forums and experiences that brought about more consciousness to the incoming students. So we would show films about the riots, the Chicano movement, etc. And that really became an opportunity for me to not only empower others, but to empower myself. So I was a new student by the time I was in my second year, and started to get to know different student groups, and Mecha in particular. And then I was recruited into Mecha because I was just visible and really helping, and it seemed like I had the right politics then of wanting to do something. And then from there, we just started to become aware of the limitations of the university to properly educate us. And we also saw the racism of the institution and the way that it supported the fraternities. I mean, back then, it was not unusual to be walking through what's called Bruin Walk, which is the main it's kind of like that center point where if you want to get from one side to the campus to another, you kind of go through there. And if you're going to go through the dorms, you're eventually going to pass through there. And that's also where the students line up, their banners or signs. And it's still that way. It's very interesting, even though we're in a different time where they'll kind of recruit you. And I just remember the way in which we'd get harassed. I mean, you're walking and they can just tell you spick, they can tell you beaner, and you could complain, and it was, it shouldn't happen, and that's about it.
Yeah.
And the fraternities would actually have parties where they would have bob wire.
Okay.
And the way to get in
Yeah.
is you had to actually get wet. They'd wet you, and you had to come in as a, quote, wetback into their party.
Yeah.
That was the norm. That was not by any means
unusual.
No.
Yeah.
They'd have parties with sombreros. They'd, and this was, I remember one of the boiling points for some of us as students was this film where it was called Lupe, and it was a donkey and a female, Mexican female, and it was all about the donkey having intercourse with Lupe, because in their eyes, we're just a bunch of sluts and whores. And that was acceptable. That was a film made at UCLA by students.
Oh, wow.
Again, that, I had, obviously, as a human being, many facets to my identity. One of them being someone that really cared and really wanted the best for everyone. And another part of me that was really upset that there were so many people in charge of our education that didn't stand up for us, that we could be harassed in class, we could be harassed walking, that we actually had to accept that it was okay to have parties that that really made us look as if we were less than human, and also where we would eventually graduate and not be able to take a class about who we are. And yet the institution itself was literally built, the bricks into the main buildings that now stand as beautiful architecture by Mexicans. The contradictions were good enough to put the bricks on the buildings, but we're not good enough to be educated. And we're also not good enough to be protected. And when we heard that the $2,000 and some dollars that were allocated to the program that gave us at least an opportunity to take a course or two was being phased, that was a turning point for us that made us very sure that the institution needed to be humbled, that the institution needed to be challenged, and that we were the students to be able to do that. And it was all these different experiences that really culminated culminated in many of us really wanting to change things. And we didn't feel at that point that it was a difficult task. We knew it was going to be a long one, but we didn't think it was impossible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then I want to rewind a little bit. So all the experiences you're having from, you realized the faculty wasn't defending you from, from all these, from the racial slurs you were getting hurled at, to racist parties that fraternities were throwing. And then to top it off, they were taking $2,000 away from, would you say, Chicano studies or ethnic studies? Or what were they taking away?
Studies.
They're taking away from Chicano studies. So after all this, I'm sure you're at a boiling point, right? Along with a lot of other students. What happened next?
Well, the university, Charles Young, who was the chancellor under his administration, they didn't stop there. Mm-hmm. They didn't stop at the 2000, which was barely anything for that, even back then, for the university to be able to afford. They started to literally take funding from other programs, other ethnic programs. The libraries were being threatened. And it was almost this movement from the administration to go against any ethnic groups and kind of put us all together under one. The problem with that is that there's a richness, as you know, that is ignored when you put all the histories and the cultures together, as if all the people just kind of blend together.
Yeah.
We were also conscious that there were programs for various European cultures, well-funded, departmentalized. And here we were just asking for a program, but the university started to insult us more by trying to cut a bunch of services for a lot of the programs that help students of color, and to go against students in general. And we thought that it wasn't enough for us to simply ask for a program. We wanted assurance that whatever we fought for would be institutionalized. So we really began to study the structure of the university and decided that a department was what would guarantee that whatever work we did would stand for time to come. And here we are, 20-some years, and the work is still there.
Yeah.
What I do want to mention that I think was extremely important, and the reason why we had a lot of students of color behind Chicana and Chicano studies. We're talking about Muslim students. We're talking about Asian students, Filipinos, Chinese, Japanese students. We're talking about Central American students from El Salvador, Guatemala. Behind this was because of what it represented. For many of us, and if you were to really look at photographs from that time, we really felt that our cultures, in terms of the native aspects of our culture, the indigenous, the part that was who we are now as a people, was important. And our group in particular really demonstrated that in the way that we fought for Chicana and Chicano studies back then, is that we really looked to traditions that strengthen our way of thinking, that would create bridges with other peoples there. So we actually would march with our regalia. We danced, we brought our drums, and others joined. And that was important. That calling was what spoke to others. And it's what helped us to be together, even though we were of different backgrounds. The ceremonial aspect of our work really brought people together in a way that I haven't seen in a long time.
So this whole thing started because also going back, they want to take funding away from the ethnic studies. So then at that point, what was your mission, or what did you want initially from the chancellor and from the school?
We really wanted every group to have more funding. We wanted every group to have more funding because we really felt that if the fraternity members could get educated, that if the university supported us, it wasn't just an investment in us. It was an investment in humanity. It was an investment in Los Angeles. It was an investment in the world, because people were graduating from UCLA essentially not having respect and not feeling an obligation to respect others. And those were really important values for us, that we would be able to also serve our community. UCLA then, and still to some extent, and more in some programs than others, do not do the work as researchers, as faculty, that support the needs of the community. So if there are problems going on in community, the idea is that we're supposed to use our intellect, our resources at the university to then see, wow, is this, how is East LA doing? How can it do better? How are the freeways impacting? How can job opportunities be better? Those are questions that the university should help out with, and that the university should be educating individuals to want to care, to want to go into the community and be able to improve it. And that was what was behind Chicana and Chicano studies, the libraries, the different groups that were also being threatened. And it's very important to remember that who knows better than you about what your community needs. And while we were all together and helping one another, the idea was that by helping Chicana and Chicano studies, that would have a ripple effect and be able to better fund the other ethnic programs as well.
Yeah. So then, how did you make your concerns known to the chancellor at the time, and what was his initial response?
Well, the chancellor didn't want to talk, so we asked for meetings, but many times we were ignored. So we took many different steps, including theater, which was very important. Remember the 80s, not too far from the 70s, not too far from the 60s, in terms of maybe the politics and the way that organizing occurred. So theater was an important part for the farm workers back then, and the way that also people became conscious of society and what was going on. So we would stage theater where students walked. We would have rallies where students walked at UCLA.
Yeah. Impromptu theaters, like you'd be walking by and there's a theater going on,
right there.
Okay.
Yeah, and we would put on, and it'd be, props that we wrote a name, we put a big sign over us, and we wrote Chancellor. And maybe a wig, maybe not a wig.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. We did role playing. We also did singing. We also called for marches, which was more typical. We also started to make sure he knew we weren't going to be ignored. So we started to follow their agendas. And back then, you can't go on the internet and find where people are at or track them. So we had our ways, and we would show up to where he or his administration would have fancy lunches with other folks and embarrass them. So part of the strategy there was to make sure that they knew we weren't going to allow them to have business as usual. And I think that's not a unfamiliar strategy now, right?
Yeah.
So we then, they started to really pay attention, because if they can't do business as usual without some students showing up, shouting different chants that were embarrassing, then it becomes difficult to silence when students don't allow themselves to be silenced. But the chancellor was a difficult person at one point, and you can find an article, and I can't say I should be quoted, but it went something like this. that over his dead body would he allow Chicano studies. And this is at a point where it's getting we're getting national attention on the issue. And he's told a reporter there was no way he would ever approve the department. He really began to hate us. It became a personal thing for him. And even though he had others telling him, negotiate, put this to rest, he didn't care. I would say he hated us, and I don't think I would be wrong to say that. It was obvious because the expressions he would make, the things he would say were not of someone that's just annoyed by someone. And it was easier to fight against someone like that because they were ridiculous, and they showed how ridiculous they were. So we had to actually use other strategies, including working with labor, which was really important, working with different groups like the Mothers of East LA, and really going out to the community. We actually started to learn more and more before we got to that point of actually taking over the faculty center, which is a takeover. And then I can also explain how we had no choice at that point. We had already created a movement with the support of the community because we already had formed an alliance, if you will, of labor, of community groups, of leadership that had been part of the 60s, the 70s, that had really pushed and knew how to work politics. So we had a lot of good mentors and support. So when we were at a point where things were kind of dying out, a group called Conscious Students of Color just really started to raise awareness all over again. And they spoke to us, their leadership spoke to us, and we decided to unite. And from there, it just exploded. And we strategized on going to the faculty center. The faculty center back then was untouchable. That's where the faculty went. They had already formed committees and invited us to their committees, but the committees were really a strategy to silence us and to say we're giving the students an opportunity, and for the chancellor to try to divert efforts of support for us from politicians, from folks that were calling, saying, well, there's a committee set up, there are committees, they can work this out, they choose not to. So we went to the faculty center and said we demanded a meeting with the chancellor. We weren't leaving. But things got out of control. They called the police and riot gear. It got so dangerous to go outside that when they threatened us, we really were concerned for our lives to even go outside. We, as students, were very concerned about students that were undocumented and asked them to leave and told them that we needed them to leave because they could not only lose their status as students, but be deported. And then some students walked out and said, I can't go all the way, but about 100 of us stayed. And the police were the ones that started to push things harder, and eventually glass was broken, but it wasn't our people that broke it. And then from there, other things happened, and they claimed that damage was done to the faculty center, and they essentially brought in pizza, forced us to watch them eat pizza after hours and hours of having us stay there, and of even handcuffing us and saying how good the pizza was. And back then you think,
so the faculty,
it's no big deal.
The police
inside
were
the faculty
you.
Center. They were taunting us. And you would think, well, that's not a big deal. We were all students. Imagine this. We're students of UCLA. We haven't eaten for hours. None of us came from an environment where we weren't loved in some way. Maybe we were poor. Maybe we didn't have, all of us had our moms and dads. But nobody, because of who we were, as you know, especially with Mexicans or Native people anywhere around the world, they'll offer you the little they have when it's time to eat.
Yeah.
It was degrading. It wasn't just that we were hungry, it was the way we were treated that really touched the core. And they wanted to further humiliate us, so they called in the sheriffs, and they sent buses for us, and they even shackled us.
Okay. Oh,
so
wow.
from
Yeah.
our feet, and we had to walk out like that and be shamed.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember that some people didn't abandon us, and this was hours late, and they purposely took us out like that once they felt more people left. But I could hear the cheering, and I could hear some people say, "What is your name? Tell us your name and your birthday." And that was because by then, Mexican attorneys in particular, and there was also attorneys I've come to know from some of the Asian groups that got together. But I remember it was this core of Mexican attorneys that got together and said, "We're getting these kids out."
Yeah.
Back then, they were calling us kids. We essentially were very young, and many of them, I was younger than most students in that group, were first or second year students. And
Right. At this point, you're a graduate student, correct? Yes.
Yeah. So about 4 years older than most others in the group. And I remember us just shouting your name, your birthday.
Yeah.
And it was, a difficult time. I mean, you're riding in a bus after being humiliated. You don't know. We didn't know if we had attorneys. We didn't think we actually had attorneys. Mm-hmm. And we didn't know what was next. And I'm going to tell you that even then, the students remained strong, because once we were in jail, they tried to divide us. They actually did a cavity search. Mm-hmm. They humiliated us by putting us in a line, having to show that we didn't have anything in our private areas. And then after that, they still took us to the side individually at times, and began to tell us that we had no future, and wanted us to give up names of students who they said had vandalized the faculty center.
Why this treatment? Do you think it was from orders from UCLA, or was this how treatment was towards the average Chicana Mexican at that time who got arrested?
It wasn't average for a UCLA student to be treated that way.
Yeah.
It never happened like that. Had in that way with 100 students. Mm-hmm. Has it happened before? I mean, look at different situations back then where Mexicans were beat up, where African Americans were beat up for no reason. So that wasn't unusual. Mm-hmm. But what was unusual was for UCLA to call the police and for them to be in riot gear and to put us through all that. And yes, that was UCLA.
Yeah.
It was. There's no doubt in my mind that they wanted it handled that way. At any point, UCLA had the power and responsibility to say, we don't care about the damage. You know who ended up helping us and paying for the damage so that we wouldn't have felonies on our records? Mm-hmm. It was a Chicano artist. He gave them a painting that's still in the faculty center.
Oh, yeah.
A famous artist. And the goodwill of a lot of people. But it was a difficult time because some students, even after we got out of jail, we started the hunger strike. Mm-hmm. Then after everyone was exhausted and we, quote, won, they then started to target different students and put them through another process to ruin them as students. And they didn't have the money.
Yeah. Before we get there, I know the hunger strike's probably the apex of this whole thing. How involved, talking about you individually, how involved were you? Let's go back to like the whole the theaters in campus, marches, demonstrations on campus as well, going where the chancellor's at and having chants and getting your message across. How involved were you in organizing all this as Minnie Ferguson?
Well, I want to say, first of all, that it took a lot of people. But in speaking about my history and, how involved I was the Women's Unit Coordinator for MECHA, and I did quite a bit of work along with others to really bring consciousness to the issue of women's issues. And for me, indigenous feminism was a really important aspect of my childhood. That's who raised me, women, mothers. And my grandmother, my mother, never raised me to think that as a female I was anything but a human being and had full potential. So I was very much someone that wanted to work in that area and to understand how we can become empowered, but through our culture and traditions. So that was an important role I had, that then led to me learning about Aztec dancing and the culture, and to learn more about our traditions going back hundreds of years and even longer before the Spanish some would like to say we were conquered, but unfortunately that happened. We're still here. But when the Europeans, and the Spanish in particular, went to Tenochtitlan and burned, a lot of what was important to us, and took some of our leaders and tortured them. For me, that part of my leadership was extremely important, because I became more aware of my history, and I finally understood why my mom spoke a lot about the city, because our family has been a part of that center of culture in Mexico. Mm-hmm. And that was really important. I really identified with that, and a lot of things started to make sense to me. And the language in particular of my mom, I remember my grandmother, how in their cooking or in the healing, they would use native words. Mm-hmm. And I found out later that's not what. And my grandmother in particular would take us to sweats. And here I was at UCLA, and to some they were becoming conscious of sweats. To me it was like, but I've done that before. Mm-hmm. That my grandmother would take us to sweats in Mexicali, where I grew up part of my life. And I thought, wow, this is who I am. So that development that I had as a leader in Mecha was so important, along with my husband and other great leaders there, and those that mentored us and folks from the community. And then eventually, because I was too old, as they put it, I was not allowed to participate in that capacity. I then became more involved as a leader with other students from Mecha that then started to want to work in a fashion that was more militant, as it was called back then. What it really meant is that you're very much someone that has a goal and you stay true to it, as kind of military. Yes. Like you're very much someone that believes that things need to continue in a fashion where your goals need to be met because there's an opposition that is against you. And I think to this day, militancy is good because it allows you to understand that there is an opposition, whether it's intentional or not, as opposed to thinking that, things are just bad and there's nothing you could do about it. Is that you actually, through study, through lots and lots of study, you begin to analyze how things work in society and how you can impact the system. And militancy doesn't mean violence. So I want to make sure that that's clear to whoever eventually is listening in on this conversation, is that militancy is not necessarily about violence. It can be, I suppose, for some, but it never was for us.
Yes.
It was always about peace. And that is why the hunger strike in particular was so monumental, because it was about peace, but yet that was militancy. So my role transformed from being in Mecha as a women's unit coordinator to just being a student leader, to then being a danzante, they would say, you know, in danza, which I was a leader for, starting along with my husband, Marcos Aguilar, and others, a group that would inspire other students to learn about the Native traditions. And then I was nominated and elected to be, as time went on, to be one of the official negotiators for the hunger strikers. There was 3 of us. But prior to that, I was actually a coordinator of the actual let me see, I think I mixed up the order there. But I was, as we started to develop the work after we got out of jail, we decided to have coordinators, and I was the coordinator of the coordinators. And we had food coordinator, we had communications coordinator, and so on. And some of the students that were coordinators were from the students, the conscious students of color. And then there was some of us who had been a part of Mecha that were also coordinators. And then you had the hunger strikers, who several of them had been in Mecha, and then others who were a faculty member at UCLA. He was in the sciences. And you had even a couple community members, a high school student that was a sister of one of the hunger strikers. So I held that position of a coordinator. By then, I actually was a student. In my second year as a master's student, I was a TA, and it was very interesting. I had my office hours at times there to give extra tutoring or help to my students. But I also was one of the 3 official negotiators, which I think was very key to making sure that the hunger strikers always had their voice, and they were the ones that chose me and the other 2 folks that were actually from the conscious students of color.
I want to go backwards real quick. When you guys went to the faculty office, what did you have in mind? Did you wanted to speak to the chancellor? Did you have a request in mind, or what were you guys seeking when you went to the faculty center?
We were seeking Chicana and Chicano studies, and we were chanting it. But that chant meant justice for everyone, and it meant the beginning of making sure that all the ethnic groups were included in the funding. That this would be the door that would open the funding for all the groups. The centers that were like a lot of the other ethnic groups had maybe a center, kind of like a research center. I don't remember if there was another type of center, but where maybe just programming occurred, and that would open the door for those groups to also become departmentalized.
Yeah. Did you want just more studies, as in more classes, or from what I've read, or were you guys seeking a department or a center, or what's the difference between all that?
We were seeking a department because a department guarantees funding. Okay. It also guarantees full faculty that can then be tenured, which means that the university doesn't get to fire because of your politics. So once you're tenured, it's not so easy to fire someone. We also wanted to make sure that we could control the curriculum. In other words, studying Chicana and Chicano studies, and I didn't mention this, but one of my other roles was I helped author the proposal that described the curriculum to the university that was to be used in the design of the department. So that was an important role. I was a curriculum writer, and to this day, director of education is that I help write curriculum. And that, I think what was so important about the department is that we demonstrated to the university that we understood the politics of how things work. Because if we would have fought for a program, the others were programs and they were getting cutbacks, and some of them are going to be phased out. A department requires that faculty participate in those decisions. So that's a lot of different circles of folks that you would have to convince in order to shut something down.
Yeah.
So for us, there was no exception. We were going to get a department. So when we went to the faculty center, we went with the purpose of talking to the chancellor, not to anyone else.
Yeah.
And that was it. It wasn't to do anything but have a meeting. And we deserved it at that point because he had never met with us.
Okay. So your main focus was to get a department. I'm assuming he said no, right?
He didn't even show up to say no.
He didn't show up to say no. So you guys had a different strategy in mind to get the department, and that's where that leads to the hunger strike, correct?
Yes, after being arrested, which we didn't mean to get arrested, but we got arrested.
Yes, after being arrested. How long after being arrested did you guys plan to do the hunger strike, or when was the hunger strike after?
Well, we actually, it's very interesting because sometimes people think that these things just kind of happen quickly. But we were very methodical about things. We were very disciplined about making sure that we took the right steps, because anything we did really was coming from a place of knowing what the right steps needed to be in order to get the attention of the university and to be able to position ourselves to be able to move further in our agenda. So the hunger strike was really not born out of us just getting out of jail and quickly getting there. Was born from us getting out of jail, and I have to credit, Marcos here, my husband, who then said, we need a sweat.
Yeah.
And others, and I have to credit everyone else, which are a lot of other people, said, let's get clarity. Ceremony is the way that this can bring us together from a place of love, not a place of hatred.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that I think really defines us, I think, for our time, and for those folks that may be thinking, what is militancy? Militancy is really about love. And if it doesn't come from love, I think it is something that is harmful. But for us, we're like, let's get together. And there was a sweat, and clarity came from there, hunger strike. But then we consulted, because students before us had tried doing a hunger strike and it didn't work. It failed for them. And we wanted to learn from them. So we actually had a meeting open. Come, let's figure this out.
Like other Mexicans in the past, or other departments?
That were considered very militant.
Yes.
And, others came before us that had attempted things. We called them for advice. They showed up, a couple of them, and heard us out. And there was a group of students that showed up, and the decision was made. And people were asked, who wants to be on the hunger strike? And it was very democratic, is what I'm saying. It was very much about consulting your people, inviting others, getting advice. And then once we were clear, which no faculty at that point thought it was a good idea. No faculty told us, yes, do it. And no faculty encouraged us. Except, I have to say, Professor Rudy Acuña, who really went out of his way to say, whatever you do, I support you. There are several professors like Steve Loza, who was extremely supportive, Juan Gomez Quiñones, extremely supportive, who were there for us. But many of these decisions needed to be taken by the students, and the students needed to make the decision. And Professor Rudy Acuna, what was remarkable about him is that he is at Northridge. He's a professor at Northridge.
Okay. Anyone out there at Northridge too, if they want to take a class.
There you go. He's definitely an example to anyone because he was a veteran. He fought for this country. He was Mexican. He wrote this book, Anything But Mexican. Mm-hmm. Which at times, sometimes we're made to feel like be anything but Mexican. Yeah. So he really understood us. And like I said, these other teachers, back then, we saw them as teachers, but they were full professors. Steve Losa's still there, and he's a remarkable person. I hardly hear about some of the professors that really put their name on paper. When we asked folks to sign, many wouldn't until it was safe to do it. So today, if you were to look at some documents, you think, wow, that person was on board. That person was on board. It is not true. Mm-hmm. Very few faculty were on board. Most tried to get in our way. They were on committees to dissuade us. And I think that it's important for anyone who wants to do something, because for that time, to have a department and to also call it Chicana and Chicano was remarkable. We were the first ones. Yeah. And I think that when you have the passion and you surround yourselves by the people that lift you and believe in you, and if you believe in yourself, you have all the ingredients you need to be able to move forward, because you know that you can count on that spirituality that you have and your culture in a way that carries you through those difficult times.
Mm-hmm. I want to paint a picture for people. How big was this in Los Angeles and in Westwood at the time? Like, were you on the news every night? How many people came to your demonstrations? I know at one point the two senators at the time, Tom Hayden and Art Torres, they were supporting you guys. They even went as far as to get the governor. I think Pete Wilson was involved. I don't know and how he was involved, but he was aware of what was going on. And like I said, the two senators, they even wrote to Bill Clinton, so Bill Clinton could get involved. So he could talk to Chancellor Young to see if they could reach a solution. So how big really was this at the time?
It was huge. You couldn't turn on the news once the hunger strike. I would say a few days into it, we had reporters there constantly. I mean, it was extremely big.
So then today, it would have been all over social media.
Yes.
All over Snapchat, everywhere. All over Instagram, all over Facebook.
Everyone would know across the United States.
It would be. It would have gone viral today.
Definitely, it was huge. The reason why it got so huge that, like you said, you couldn't turn on the TV and not know about it. We had boxes upon boxes upon boxes of signed petitions. Mm-hmm. I mean, thousands and thousands. Remember, we don't have the internet to get petitions signed. Yeah. People have to physically go sign them at the university. We're talking about folks you don't have ways to beat the traffic. Mm-hmm. We're way out there isolated. People were making their way to sign our petitions. Children from local elementaries here in East LA were signing letters, were sending us pictures. We were getting a lot of mail, a lot of letters being dropped off to us. Everyone, I would say almost everyone knew about us. Mm-hmm. And I think that became so important, because then it encouraged others like these leaders, these politicians, to help us. The reason why the chancellor eventually caved in, because remember, he said, "Over my dead body," to a reporter, something to that effect, that they were at a point where they already could secure withholding funding from UCLA, state funding. That's how big it got. Yeah. So UCLA was not going to get state funding if the chancellor did not negotiate with us. They were at that point. They were threatening the university. Art
I have Tom Hayden
Yes,
and Art Torres.
they worked there, and they already had the necessary folks behind them to be able to do it.
Mm-hmm. I read an interesting story about Tom Hayden for preparing for this interview, that he actually met Cesar Chavez, and he was inspired by Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez said, "Don't just be a senator. Be give something back to the community. Make your do something good for your name." And he said from that moment he was inspired by Cesar Chavez, and that's why he was an ardent supporter of you guys.
Yeah, and I think that we were at each point we were very thoughtful about the way in which we would represent ourselves, and it mattered a lot. And it mattered a lot how we communicated our mission. So because at the point at which we won, we actually won, but gave the university time to be able to then departmentalize the program. So first went into we actually had already named the department. It was Cesar Chavez, interdisciplinary something. I can't remember the exact name now, but it actually went through a couple of phases.
Okay.
And even though we negotiated, we needed in writing that it would be a department. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that the university had to do was actually guarantee us, or we were not going to negotiate. I think between the funding on the chancellor's end, because he didn't care about the students dying. Yeah. He didn't care about one of his faculty dying. He didn't care about the community members that were going to die. The community did. The politicians involved did. The world was caring that the students could die. And I think that really got things going. I mean, we're already on the 13th day, the 14th day. Their organs were already impacted, and they were starting to really lose kind of muscle strength in their muscles. And it was just such an important community or gathering of the community, where we had students from the sciences that became very involved and would go and check on them and check their vitals and support them. And everyone could see that they were really becoming weak, and that perhaps they would have problems with their organs. And that also became a key factor, because there was, sometimes it's effective, but there are limitations to fasting for a day or two, or when you do fasting and you say, I'm going to fast, and someone comes and fasts, and we fast for 30 days, 40 days, but each person's fasting a day. Yeah. This was real. This was to the death. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of union of people, these were students. These were students that came to the university in hopes of doing better for their family, for the community, for the world. And here they were about to die. Mm-hmm. And that really started to, I think, upset and anger the community in a way where marches started to take place. One of them was all the way from La Placita, being a very central place and a very a landmark, a historic place, where the beginnings of many of the people, both Mexican, also Chinese, have a history there, as well as African American people in terms of their roots, and people from Mexico coming that also had African roots and settling there. So it was very spiritual to start there, to know we belong here. We have our roots here. We not only deserve, but we demand a better education. We demand that our children not be treated this way. Yeah. So the march was started from there and went all the way to UCLA. And that, I think, was another turning point that really was important in bringing more attention to to our plight.
Yeah. Doing hunger strike's a really big commitment. The end result could mean death. Why? I think you kind of answered this question a little bit. Maybe I'm looking for a little bit more of a deeper answer. Why did it mean death to have this department at UCLA? Why was it so important that your classmates, your friends were willing to die to have a department at UCLA?
When I spoke earlier about the harassment, the hostility, the attacks that we received, that's no way to live. Mm-hmm. It's no way to live. And we, as a group, had taken a lot of steps and ceremony in knowing that we had our community who had done so much. Many had died along the way in the foundation of this country. Many have died. Many have been hung. Many have been enslaved. I mean, all the people that have helped to make this life of ours possible, from different ethnic groups, from different nationalities. How are we more important than them? How would we be able to justify that we could only do a little more when we know who we are? Mm-hmm. That our people have been enslaved, that other people fighting alongside of us have been enslaved, that we can't even go from one class to another without being attacked. That's no way to live. Mm-hmm. And we knew that for us to be able to graduate from that university and be able to do what we want to do for our community and for everyone else, that we had to do it. We had no choice. Mm-hmm. And we didn't see a choice in the matter. And we weren't afraid to continue in the examples that we saw. So Cesar Chavez was an example. He influenced us. I had spoken earlier about being involved in Danza Azteca. When Cesar Chavez passed away, we were invited to be a part of both the march and to be able to dance in his memory. Mm-hmm. And it impacted us. It impacted us in a way that I think was very important in the timing of things, that really helped us to know that he had given so much, but he was an example and a symbol for all those that have helped, both male, female, whether Mexican or Asian or African American or African or wherever you were from. He was a symbol. And for us, there was no doubt that it needed to be done. And there was no doubt at any point that we would take it all the way. And I think that the fact that we had what was called back then like a base, and our camp, we had a big tent. It was like an army-style tent where all the hunger strikers slept in a quad facing Royce Hall and not far from the faculty center. We were almost a symbol for the university of what was wrong with them. Mm-hmm. And yet we were an inspiration to everyone else, because no one that visited thought it was a joke or it wasn't going to be taken all the way. And that is such an important act, the act of truth, mm-hmm. the act of faith. So nobody ever visited thinking, oh, they'll cave in. Everyone could see in their eyes that this was to the death.
Yes.
And there's a difference when you are a part of a struggle and people say, we're going to do it no matter what. most people don't say that, right? They don't say no matter what. They just say this is important, this is our goal, this is what we're going to do. But we said to the death.
Yeah.
And we took all the necessary steps to show we're living here, we're going to stay here, and we're not leaving this space until you give us what we want.
Mm-hmm. So the hunger strike ended on the 14th day with what resolution?
The resolution was a signed statement that we would get the department and that there would be a interdisciplinary program that was the Cesar Chavez interdisciplinary program that would serve as a first stage to honoring the contract. And the first few faculty would be selected and students would have a voice in it.
Okay.
And that was key because we fought for students to be able to choose the faculty. So the university would not just control it. And there was measures like that we had negotiated. So while our proposal in its entirety, in terms of all the curriculum and so on, wasn't what ended up being approved, but it was, but the core of it and the types of courses was what was approved.
Yeah. I guess like a couple of days after that, a week after that, how were your feelings? How were you in spirits?
It was difficult. I had lost so much weight. Back then I weighed about 117, 5'8". And that was my usual weight. I was very thin to begin with. I wasn't a hunger striker, but all the coordinators and all the folks that stayed there every day, and I have to credit the security teams, the people that brought in food for the organizers, the children that stayed there, the families that stayed there, our own families that had to visit there. I mean, I really would have to go on and on. I feel badly that I also feel I can't speak for them because everyone has maybe a different opinion, perhaps, or different things they might remember that are more important to them. Although we've had some reunions, I think I can say that a lot of what I'm saying, is our shared feelings and memories, because I've had the opportunity to also talk some of these things out, and then you begin to piece things in a way where you know that those were key moments, that some of the things that were key to you were the key things for others. Yeah. So what happened was that for us, we had lost so much weight, and Marcos, who was a hunger striker, my husband, was very, very weak. And remember that by then they were only drinking water. And they really needed to transition to eating, and that takes days if you're to do it properly. Be able to catch up with your schoolwork, because the quarter's ending. Yeah. And I'm at the point
I'll be
where...
honest, I forgot even the school was in session.
Yes,
you guys have
and
homework
and I'm at the
tests.
point where I'm supposed to get my master's degree. So I have to submit my partial thesis. I was in the School of Urban Planning, so was considered and is a professional school. So your master thesis is more along the lines of perhaps 100 pages or so. But it's called a partial thesis. So that has to get turned in unless I'm going to stay there longer.
I was so concentrated on the story that I forgot school was in session.
Oh, the hunger strikers are submitting schoolwork as we go along. The people that got in prison, imagine, what do you tell your professor? I was in jail, you know? I mean, you had to buckle down, and I mean, many of us would be doing our work and studying and around 2 to 4 in the morning, going to class and quickly coming back and then doing the press conference or whatever you needed to do, or go to the meetings, or tend to the hunger strikers or whatever, because we were so purposeful about everything, and so everything required care. So not just anyone could be around the hunger strikers. We were really concerned. We had You know, when I say we had no choice, we literally did not have choice in the matter. When it was probably around our second day or so, the universe started to turn. Even our first day, the sprinklers on at night.
Oh, wow.
We had to negotiate that because then we were waking up wet. We didn't have restrooms. They had to negotiate. It was starting to look bad that they weren't going to give us access to the restrooms in the buildings, and we also had to worry about their safety. So there was a community group of Native folks that got together, and they were our security because we heard that the fraternities and other groups were going to come attack us. And by that means beating us up at night while we were asleep. So we had to have people up all night and taking shifts through the whole thing in order for us to be safe. If you were walking on campus, you had to protect yourself. Not every faculty member who was your professor was on board with what you might be doing. So it was a very difficult time. And though you think, what could get you through all that? And I have to say that while many of us still deal with some of the issues that happened back then, from being taken by the police, the way we were taken into jail and what happened and the things that happened there and the way we were treated after, and the hunger strike and so on. Imagine the toll it takes on a body and the toll that it takes on your mind. Many still went on to become professors, lawyers, prominent people. And this was because it gave us the clarity that we needed at that university when it was such a hostile place. And it for some, they felt that it gave them more purpose and that they chose their careers based on what they learned during their arrest, the hunger strike, the negotiating period, and then what came after. So for us, we were at a point where he needed to heal health-wise and where I was graduating. And that summer was a difficult summer for us because we had to really watch him. And we then integrated ourselves back in to be able to go attend some of the meetings where we were working out how the hiring process would work out and so on. But I really saw that there was some ugliness to that, where some of the faculty all of a sudden claimed they were a part of the whole process and started to try to invite their friends and get them hired. And we just decided at that point that we needed to move on and to really continue the work that we had started, and making sure that our community had a school where we could really understand our identity, our culture, our languages as indigenous people, as people that belong. This is why that march from La Placita was so important, is we belong, we demand, and we wanted to continue in that way. So I had already applied to law school. I got an offer that was really pretty good. And I just thought, I can't be just locked up in a office. I can't just be in one fight over another over a yes or no. I had learned that sometimes you don't get a yes for everything, but that you can negotiate. And for me back then, I didn't see that opportunity to be able to do that if I went to law school. I think now there would have been more of a possibility, because you can actually be an attorney and not even go to court. You can specialize in writing. You can specialize in before you go to court to negotiate. But I think at that point I was very invested in education and continuing with that, and urban planning. So I had actually followed the track of urban planning, and I was actually studying public policy and women in particular in housing. And I really saw land development as an important issue for our community, because Native people have always been displaced. So that's where the housing comes in. That's where the urban planning comes in, and land development. And then on top of that, the women. Remember, that's something that really has been very clear from the time I was probably born. I was always very outspoken. Except when I came to the United States, it's hard to speak when you're dismissed, right? So, but my voice was always there. So I continued to go down a path of not wanting to be in an office and to not see my life as going in and out of court, but to be among people and to work with a broader community and to build bridges with other peoples of other nationalities and maybe around the world. Even back then, I saw it as that big. So both my husband and I decided to go into education and to give ourselves more time. And then from there, I really have to credit him. He had the vision of we can start our own charter school. Back then, it was only white folks that were charter developers. And they got funding and they were able to get things going. Well, we had to do everything ourselves from the ground up and write our own documents. We weren't even attorneys, and we had to start looking at educational law and so on.
Yeah. Well, you actually made the transition for me. You're actually a better host than I am. So yeah, after UCLA, after the hunger strike, to me, your life just gets more interesting. Like you already mentioned, you opened a charter school, and when I was thinking about it for this past week, preparing for this interview, I've met a lot of people in my life, but I've never met anyone outside of you. It's not common to say, "Hey, I've co-founded, I've opened a charter school." I think that's. I'm not an educator. I've never been into really pursued education as a career, but I would think that's like the apex. That's the top of the top. What an educator wants to do, to open their own school, to open their own charter school. Talk about that a little bit. How did you come to the idea that you want to open a charter school and climb another mountain?
Oh wow! I guess I did go for another. Another
challenge.
Yeah,
a big challenge. Like I said, I don't meet too many people who say, I don't meet people that say, I want to open my own school or I've opened my own school. It's very rare.
It is. I have to say it is because, there weren't, that I knew of, any Native folks that had done that, like from the ground up, unique, our own curriculum, our own way of governing, etc. And there weren't any Mexicans. There was no one we could go to. There wasn't a mentor now. In the past, we could go to someone. But what we did have is support in terms of us knowing who we were, going to Native peoples. But it was such an important thing to continue, even though we couldn't turn to anyone that could give us that technical expertise. We went to some of the Native elders, and we went to Tongva, and she actually referred to herself as Gabrielino, Vera Rocha and her husband Manuel Rocha, and we got their blessing. They said, because they're the original peoples of this land, of LA and so on, and along with other nations and other groups. But she was one of the official people. And her blessing gave us that clarity that we were doing the right thing. She says, you have my blessing to start this school. We had done work. When we transitioned, there's just so much to cover in this. And you ask questions that just make me think, wow,
well, that's
I
what
really
wanted.
should explain.
I wanted you able to think. I wanted to give as much detail as possible. Like I said, because I know that you'll inspire others and you'll really help others as well. So the more detail, the better.
Good. So along all of this that I'm explaining, there's a lot of work that we do outside of Chicana and Chicano studies, per se, in terms of a department at UCLA, is to work with Native groups, both federally enrolled and those that are not. And Vera was such an inspiration because she was an elder. She was, I'm sure, over 60. And she fought always against developers. She fought against the cities. And it was her and her husband and the folks she could get. And sometimes she was there by herself. And that really stood out for me, that you don't need 100 people behind you. You need yourself and a few people that believe in you. Mm-hmm. And when she said we had her blessing, I felt like it was a done deal. We were going to do this. Because to this day, we're not just a charter school. We can go before the public and say we have the blessing of the original peoples here through one of the chiefs, that we have a right to this education. And I think that that's something so unique, that it's really the apex of it all, is that we don't only have right now the permission of the state to operate, the permission of the local school district, we have the permission of the people who have cared for this land. And it really inspired us, because she really taught us how to fight when you're alone, and how to keep going. And her husband, and they were very, very strong people. There was a point at which she could barely walk, and she still made those appointments. She still spoke before a city council. What excuse would be mine? Mm-hmm. Able-bodied, young, what would it be? That it's too hard? It just didn't make sense. Thinking of my mom, my grandmother, my sister, of our family, thinking of all these people who had influenced me, that I had so much more. I had a UCLA education. I had all these experiences. And Marcos, my husband, I really have to say, I really think he's the smartest person I've ever personally known. And it made sense to me. And I said, I can write this. We can write our own charter. Mm-hmm. We had people almost laugh at us. Yeah. And especially because we were Mexican.
I'm not surprised people laughed at you. Like I said, it's opening up a school, man. I can't even think of where I would even begin.
And remember, we're not trained. You had to put together, there's, all the different elements of a charter. How you're going to hire your employees. Yeah. The laws behind it. You had to really align to all the ed code, the legislation that defined what your charter should look like. And then all the politics of LAUSD, mm-hmm. the politics of how you get your funding. We're grassroots and still are. We don't receive funding from, we're not backed by any particular billionaire. We're not at all funded by more than the state, really, and grants from Native peoples, mm-hmm. and some leaders out there that have really supported us throughout. So we're really what some would call a mom and pop type of charter school, yeah. literally, because ours is very organic and very community based. Our school is so different from any other school, and we're very different as leaders in that our focus is so unique. There is no charter school like this anywhere else. There are no schools like this in Mexico, where yeah. Nahuatl is spoken more widely. We are the only ones, still in 2019. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I've contributed so far, that I can say, wow, I can take a step back and say that is unique. Mm-hmm. And I think when you can say that, your job's barely begun.
Wow. A lot the things you've accomplished, a lot. I can imagine a lot of people saying I'm done.
Yeah.
So I want to go back a little bit to
we have other plans. We can talk about that later.
that could be part 2. What made you arrive to what series of events or experiences led you to one day say, I want to open a charter school? What was your experience as an educator? What did you see that said, you know what, I'm better off serving my students and the community by opening a charter school?
My experiences as a child in the LAUSD schools. And I'm going to tell you that there were several experiences. I actually enjoyed a lot of support from my principals. I'm very hardworking. I was always as a student. I would, even during, probably just when I got arrested and a few other times when it was physically impossible, I never missed class. Just mm-hmm. never did.
Yeah.
I'd study at all hours when I traveled from one meeting to another. I pulled out my books. I was just very, very interested in taking full advantage of any moment I could to read and to learn and to engage with others and to participate in forums and to go out in the community and learn from experts and whoever I could. So for me, it was so obvious that nothing existed that pulled all that together for me as a youth. That while I had a very good experience at Lincoln High School, the teachers that supported me, I can't say that it wasn't a good experience. But what I can remember is that there was always groups of students that didn't get what I got. And while I work hard and someone could say, well, you earned it, you should have been put in A through G courses. I had friends. When I was in 11th grade, I actually became the student body president. I was the first female in grade 11 in the history of the school to be elected.
First female and first
female
and first 11th grade.
For 11th grade.
Oh, for 11th grade. Okay.
Because student body presidents were to be voted in.
Yeah.
You had to know enough students back then. So that meant that you were usually a senior. You didn't get voted in as an 11th grader. So I was told I was the first female 11th grader to be student body president at Lincoln High School. Mm-hmm. And what really stood out for me was my experience at UCLA and why I wanted to make sure that all the things that I had to work towards that were outside of the classrooms of UCLA were there for our youth so that they could have a better future than I even had, and that they didn't have to get arrested, that they didn't have to go on a hunger strike, that they didn't need to do all those things. And we really thought of the importance of that. So when I was a teacher and I was working for the LA Unified School District, I tried to, provide a curriculum that was more enriching and to bring Aztec dance to the students. And I was allowed to do a lot of that. But I remember there being a couple of key moments that said to me, this isn't going to work. One of them was that I was asked as a teacher to work for the LA Unified School District. We have to build something different.
Got it.
Because I asked for certain things that I think anyone hearing this would say we're still fighting for that at times in the schools. Is that we were asked to nominate students for certificates. And I always remembered how important it was to get recognition. It was so important that at times that's what really impacted me in a way that was harmful, yet it did make me more resilient, but very harmful. Like I didn't need to go through that experience to define me. And I submitted the name of an English learner student. Mm-hmm. So this was someone who was not proficient. They had an ELD level of, I believe it was like a 2 or 3. And I was told that I couldn't. I said, but there's no rule. You didn't tell me that I couldn't say. Well, giving them a reading certificate would mean they could read. Mm-hmm. I said, but for their level, they received an A. And we were supposed to back then give them a grade based on their level. But we were to write that it was for, let's say, ELD level 2. And I got put through such humiliation. I was threatened with my job because I said, I am not changing the name. Mm-hmm. You will have to do it yourself because I'm not doing it. No, you need to do it. You do what you need to do, but I'm not changing it. Mm-hmm. And I felt the whole experience of my childhood in the LAUSD, my experiences at UCLA happen all over again. Yeah. And when I tried to get attention of higher ups, no one wanted to listen.
Same thing again at UCLA.
Yes. And then there were other instances similar to that where it just was an impossible thing. And where others started to tell me, you know, in a way where they cared for me. But I began to see that some people were just, what some would say, jaded, you know?
Probably.
They were in the system for too long. And they told me, you know what? Let me tell you, stop trying so hard. You're actually sort of messing it up for us. Because...
That sounds like the same attitude at UCLA too. Jaded,
yes.
You're messing it up for us. We have everything perfectly in place. Why come ruin it?
Exactly. And here was Marcos, also the same thing. And many were attempting. So when we put our proposal forth or spoke to people in LAUSD, it was like, you're crazy. You know, no.
Yeah.
What, even speak a native language? No, there's none of that going on here. They were phasing out all dual language bilingual back then, bilingual programs and some dual language programs. That by the time it didn't happen overnight. It took us like 2 years of constant door knocking, politicians telling us, no way.
You're talking about the charter school now.
The charter school. Mm-hmm. Because back then, you know, and still to this day, labor supports or doesn't support charter schools because many of the teachers are not unionized in charter schools. But our school, we would not have a problem existing within the LAUSD. Our example is institutionalized, but there's no space for us. Yes. To this day, there is no space for us. We actually... Once we were institutionalized and LAUSD adopted us as an autonomous school, meaning they allowed us to have our curriculum, a lot of attacks happened, including bomb threats and things like that made it so difficult for us to be rechartered, where except for Monica Garcia, who stood up for us and said, this is a school that our community needs. They are community-based. All of their board members said no. And we ended up being sent to the county where we got asked by a board member there if we were citizens. Mm-hmm. What did that have to do with the amount of discrimination? You're in a board meeting and they're asking you if you're a citizen and not about your charter petition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know we could do a whole another episode, an hour or two, about the whole chartering, yes. The charter process and chartering the school. But for the sake of time, I know it's getting a little late. I just really want to highlight about your school is that you guys have Aztec dances, correct? Classes or as an extracurricular activities?
No, our students in the elementary level receive instruction as part of dance several times a week. Okay. We also have a community circle for their parents and so on once a week. And for the middle and high school, they take it as an extracurricular. We also offer Nahuatl, which is all the small children receive it. And in middle and high school, they actually take a course. Mm-hmm. And in high school, we have Nahuatl 1 and 2 approved, A through G. So it meets a foreign language requirement, which isn't really a foreign language for us. Yeah. But you could essentially take 1 and 2 and satisfy Nahuatl 1 and 2 and satisfy your A through G requirements. And that's a huge accomplishment. We're the first ones in the United States that I know of to have accomplished that. And to this day, we're one of the few schools, I'm sure, that have an A through G approved Nahuatl program.
I think that's what I like most about your school is that you guys teach Nahuatl. How did you arrive to that decision that we want to bring Nahuatl to the East LA community, to El Sereno?
We'd love to bring in all the other native languages. Sure it really is about resources, but it is who we are. So remember, our job, I feel, has always been to unite. And for us, Nahuatl is a language that's spoken beyond the borders of Mexico. And we see ourselves as Native people, and we want to build bridges with our brothers and sisters to the north, to the south of us. Nahuatl is also a Euro-Aztecan language. So what that means is that some of the natives from what's now the United States territory have a history with our people so that there are some commonalities in the language. So it was really a strategic move of, you have limited resources. How are you, with the one language that's native, going to build a bridge that would unite rather than divide? And that's how we arrived at Nahuatl.
Mm-hmm. Also, too, I know outside of the high school, you have a lot of Aztec art on the walls, too. And I just want to say, it's beautiful artwork. I believe that, when someone sees something every day, they eventually get integrated into that same image. It's like if you're going to work on the 101 and you see the same billboard every day, it just becomes stuck in your head, right? So I think a lot of kids seeing that Aztec artwork really relate to their culture, relate to their ancestors. And I think that's a pretty cool thing.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
I think that that'll conclude our interview for today. Like I said, it's already getting late. If people want to get involved in your school, if they want to support, how can they do it?
Well, first of all, thank you for giving me this honor to be a part of a process that will engage others to continue this dialogue. It's an important one for our youth in particular. They can get involved by visiting our website, dignidad.org, and they can also sign petitions on our website. They can also write letters to us. They can also go on different platforms to read our newsletters, to also keep up with some of the work we do out in the community to support other leaders, other causes. We post what our students are doing. We sure would like some likes. We'd also like for others to have their followers see what we're up to and what we're doing, what our youth are engaging in. So I think there's just a lot of different ways. I think that it's important for others to know that that we can unite and that we can help one another to keep thinking of more creative ways to contribute. Because in the end of it all, I would have to say that one of the things we do well as Native people is that we dream, and we know how to dream, and that our dreams help us to imagine and to be creative. And there are always creative ways to reach your dreams. So I want to leave everyone with that, is that always dream and always be around those that like dreaming.
Minnie Ferguson, everyone. I couldn't have asked for a better guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas.